The crew of the Baychimo thought they'd escaped a death sentence when they abandoned her to the Arctic ice in 1931. Trapped and left to her fate, she should have gone down like so many ships before her, but she refused to die. Nearly 40 years later, she was still being seen, drifting through frozen seas, empty and silent, her steel hull scarred but intact. The Baychimo became one of history's most documented ghost ships, and one of its strangest. Her story isn't just about a ship left behind. It's about what happens when the Arctic refuses to let go, and when a ship built for trade becomes a legend of endurance and mystery. Welcome to Shipwreck History. This is part 1 of our 4-part series on ghost ships. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. It goes a long way in helping our channel. The ship that would later become Baychimo began life in 1914 at the Lindholmen's shipyard in Gothenburg, Sweden. She was a steel-hulled cargo steamer, 230 feet long, and just over 1,300 gross tons. Modest, efficient, and built to handle northern waters. With a reinforced bow for ice and steady steam propulsion, she was designed for reliability over speed, a working ship meant to last. During the First World War, she served on northern European trade routes, operating through the constrained Baltic, where shifting alliances and blockades made every voyage a calculation of risk. In 1921, she was sold to the Hudson's Bay Company, who renamed her Baychimo and sent her into far harsher territory, the Arctic coast of Canada. The company needed a dependable vessel to reach their remote trading posts, as settlements lived and died by the short shipping season. Each summer, Baychimo carried flour, tea, tools, ammunition, and mail up north, and returned south with the year's harvest. Furs were gathered by indigenous trappers, who traveled for weeks or months to the company post, where supplies were traded for pelts that kept the enterprise alive. These voyages demanded precision and nerve. The shipping window opened only briefly, from July through early October, when ice retreated enough to clear a path. A new route had to be chosen each season, since Arctic currents and wind could shift channels by miles. Baychimo's circuit took her through the Bering Strait, along Alaska's north coast, and east into Canadian waters. She stopped at small outposts like Herschel Island, where goods had to be ferried to shore by small boats, because no harbors existed. Crews worked quickly, racing against the daylight and weather, knowing one sudden freeze could end the voyage. For nearly a decade, Baychimo made those journeys without major incident. She became a familiar sight to the communities she supplied, a lifeline in summer and vanishing as the ice came each fall. No one could have imagined she'd one day outlast them all, alone on the same waters. The 1931 season began like any other. Baychimo left Vancouver in July, under Captain Sidney Cornwell's command, carrying cargo and provisions for the Hudson's Bay Northern Trading Post. Through the summer she followed the familiar route along Alaska's coast, delivering supplies and collecting furs for the return journey. By early October, her work was nearly done, and the crew turned south toward home. Then, winter arrived early. On October 1st, pack ice closed around the ship near Point Barrow on the northern tip of Alaska. The ice held firm, locking the vessel in place but not crushing her. Cornwell had faced drifting ice before, but this freeze came fast and heavy. He couldn't tell whether it would release within days or hold for months. In 1931, forecasts relied on shortwave radio and scattered coastal reports, but none offered any certainty about what lay ahead. Each day the ice tightened its grip. The Baychimo drifted until she stood motionless, surrounded by an endless white plain. The season was finished, temperatures were falling, and her supplies were never meant to last through winter. Cornwell weighed the options and radioed Hudson's Bay for direction. If the hull began to crush, rescue would be impossible. On October 15th, company aircraft arrived to take most of the crew to safety. The landings on uneven ice were risky but successful. 22 men were flown out. 15 chose to stay, believing the ship might still break free once the weather shifted. They built a wooden shelter about half a mile from Baychimo, using lumber from the ship. It was basic, but secure enough to survive in. From there, they kept watch, checking the vessel daily and recording ice conditions while the light faded and the temperature dropped. The Arctic winter closed in quickly. Inside the shelter, the crew rationed supplies, repaired gear, and kept a small stove running. The work became routine: watch the ice, check the ship, and survive. On November 24th, a blizzard rolled over the region. The men stayed inside as the wind howled across the ice, shaking their shelter and driving snow through every crack. It lasted through the night. When they stepped outside the next morning, the landscape had changed completely. The ice field was broken apart, and nothing could be seen but open water. Baychimo was gone. Cornwell assumed she'd been crushed and pulled beneath the ice during the storm. Several days later, a local seal hunter reached their camp and reported sighting a ship still afloat, roughly 45 miles from their location. Cornwell and a few men followed him across the ice and found Baychimo caught in another frozen lead. She was battered but still upright. They boarded her, retrieved the most valuable furs, and secured what they could before turning back. With the season closing and the ice thickening again, saving her was impossible. They left her behind a second time, believing that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The Baychimo began a second life that would last decades. Within days of her final abandonment, she was spotted drifting about 300 miles east of her last known position. The ship that should have gone down was still moving through Arctic waters, carried by currents no one could predict. In January 1932, prospector Leslie Melvin encountered Baychimo during a journey from Herschel Island. He boarded briefly, finding her decks covered in snow but her structure intact, before continuing his trip south. By then, word of the ghost ship had begun spreading through northern settlements. That August, a group of 20 indigenous men found her near Wainwright and climbed aboard. A sudden storm trapped them on the vessel for a week before rescue arrived. They reported she was still intact, except for a crack along one side, damage that somehow hadn't sent her to the bottom. The pattern continued. In March 1933, another group boarded her and found themselves stranded for 10 days when weather closed in around them. By the time they escaped, the ship had drifted 250 miles from where they'd first reached her. That August, the crew of a small schooner spotted her locked in ice off Wainwright. The crew tried to tow her free but couldn't break the ice's grip. They salvaged what they could and left her behind. Sightings became routine through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Hunters and traders reported seeing her frozen solid in pack ice or drifting freely during summer thaws. In November 1939, Captain Hugh Polson boarded her with plans to salvage the vessel, but shifting ice forced him to abandon the attempt. It was the last time anyone is confirmed to have set foot on her deck. She continued to appear throughout the following decades. Some encounters were brief glimpses from passing ships. Others were close enough to confirm her identity beyond doubt. In March 1962, she was spotted still adrift, battered but recognizable more than 30 years after she'd been left behind. The final reported sighting came in 1969. By then she'd been wandering Arctic waters for 38 years, far beyond any ship's expected survival. What happened after that remains unknown. The sightings simply stopped, and the ghost ship that had refused to die finally disappeared for good. The Baychimo's survival defied expectations, but the reasons weren't supernatural. Her steel hull resisted the cold better than wood ever could. Arctic waters preserve rather than destroy, slowing rust and deterioration to a crawl. When ice caught her, she likely rose and drifted instead of fighting back. Other ships trapped in the same waters lasted months before being crushed. She lasted decades. Eventually, time would have done what the ice couldn't. Every collision, every freeze and thaw, weakened her a little more. By the late 1960s, she was probably taking on water with every drift. In 2006, the Alaskan government launched a search, flying grid patterns over her last known routes and scanning the seabed with sonar. Nothing was ever found. For nearly 40 years, the Baychimo moved between history and legend. To those along the Arctic coast, she became a story retold every winter. Most historians believe she sank sometime after 1969, her hull finally giving out. But without wreckage, her story stays open. What do you think happened to the Baychimo? Was she finally claimed by the Arctic, or is she still out there somewhere, drifting beneath the ice and fog? Three experienced sailors set out from Queensland in April 2007 for what should have been a straightforward coastal voyage. Within days, their catamaran was found drifting near the Great Barrier Reef with the engine still running. The men had simply disappeared, no distress call, no signs of struggle. Nothing. What happened to them is still a mystery to this day. But let's dive into the clues found in the days after their disappearance, to see what they tell us about what most likely happened to them. Welcome to Shipwreck History. This is the second part of our October Ghost Ship series. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and help support our channel. Don't forget to check out part 1 about the ghost ship of the Arctic. The Kaz II was a 30-foot catamaran, the kind of vessel you see in marinas along Australia's coast. Nothing particularly special about her, which made what happened all the more unsettling. She belonged to Derek Batten, a 56-year-old from Perth who'd bought her the year before. Batten had taken sailing courses and made a couple of shorter trips around the Whitsunday Islands. He knew enough to be confident, but the upcoming voyage was beyond anything he'd done before. He brought along his neighbors, brothers Peter and James Tunstead, 69 and 63. The Tunsteads had been sailing together since they were teenagers, and had even volunteered in radio rooms. They knew their way around boats, though mostly smaller ones. They planned a long coastal voyage, eventually circling northern Australia and returning to Perth. On April 15, 2007, they departed from Airlie Beach's Able Point Marina. The first leg was straightforward, north to Townsville, about 170 kilometers up the coast. The Great Barrier Reef stretched out to the east, and the weather, while a bit choppy, was not anything alarming. Nothing complicated about it, just a couple days up the coast to get a feel for the boat. The next day, April 16th, a commercial fisherman named Gavin Howland was working a reef off Bowen when he spotted something odd. A white yacht, with a torn sail, drifting between the reefs. He came within 50 meters but couldn't see anyone aboard. The boat was moving through a narrow passage at about 3 knots, pushed by the current. Howland thought it was strange seeing a sailboat in an area known for shallow water, but he had a policy about not approaching other vessels. He didn't report it. That sighting would later become crucial to understanding the timeline. 2 days later, a helicopter spotted the same yacht drifting further north near the Great Barrier Reef. Something was off here. When maritime authorities finally caught up with the vessel on April 20th, they prepared for the worst. What they found was somehow more disturbing than bodies. Step aboard the Kaz on that April afternoon, and you'd think the crew had just stepped away for a moment. The diesel engine was running, sitting in neutral, just burning fuel while the boat drifted wherever the current took it. The cabin lights were on. All the navigation systems, the GPS, the radio, everything was functional and still powered up. A laptop sat open and running. The table had food and utensils laid out. All of the life jackets were still neatly stowed. The fenders were deployed along the side of the hull, though investigators would later determine through video evidence and witness accounts that they'd left port that way. Small craft often do. But here's what made investigators pause. One of the sails was badly shredded. Not just worn or weathered, but torn up in a way that suggested either violent weather or a struggle with the rigging itself. And there was video footage, recorded by James Tunstead on the morning they disappeared. The footage showed the boat with a long rope trailing behind it, the coastline visible in the background, the sea conditions moderate but choppy. Later, investigators would use landmarks in that video to pinpoint almost exactly when and where things started to go wrong. James's shirt and glasses were found on the deck, placed on the back seat. He'd taken them off at some point that morning. No one knows why. Forensic teams spent hours going through the vessel. Sergeant Paul Malloy, one of 3 forensic officers who examined the Kaz after she was towed back to shore, looked for any sign of foul play, signs of a struggle, evidence that someone else had been aboard. He found nothing. No fingerprints that shouldn't be there. No indication whatsoever that this was anything other than the 3-man crew going about their voyage. Under the galley bench, fishing knife sheaths sat unused. Under Batten's bed, a sealed container held a firearm and ammunition, all accounted for. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the men themselves. The Kaz was perfectly seaworthy. It should have been impossible for 3 men to vanish from her deck. The search for the three men was massive and included helicopters, planes, and boats from multiple volunteer rescue units. They analyzed data from the Kaz's GPS system to narrow down where the crew might have gone overboard. A survival time expert concluded that if they'd been in the water since April 15th or 16th, they were almost certainly dead. The waters were choppy, none of them were particularly strong swimmers, and the window for survival was narrow. The search was called off on April 21st, though another attempt was made a few days later after new information came in. Again, nothing was found. In August 2008, State Coroner Michael Barnes held an inquest in Townsville. 27 witnesses testified. Some had seen the ship during its voyage. Others helped piece together what the crew had been doing in those final hours. Derek's wife, Jennifer, testified that her husband had been well prepared, that they'd originally planned to make the voyage as a couple, but Derek had worried that only two people might not be safe, so he'd asked the Tunsteads to come along. The coroner had to work with incomplete information. He openly admitted in his official report that he couldn't be definitive about exactly how the deaths occurred. But based on the physical evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and that video footage, he proposed the most likely scenario. Sometime on the morning of April 15th, around 10:05 a.m., the Kaz was sailing near George Point. Everything was fine. Within the next hour, things changed dramatically. The men had hauled in a white rope that had been trailing behind the boat and bundled it up on the foredeck, possibly to dry. James took off his shirt and glasses. And then came the problem. A fishing lure had become entangled around the port rudder. This is where the coroner's scenario begins. One of the Tunstead brothers most likely went to free it. The Kaz had what's called a sugar scoop platform at the stern, a low platform close to the waterline which made falling in easy and getting back aboard nearly impossible. The coroner believes that this is when the first brother went overboard. The second brother, seeing what happened, attempted a rescue, and he went over too. Now, Derek Batten was alone on a moving boat with two men in the water behind him. He needed to turn around. To do that, he had to adjust the sails, and this is where that shredded sail comes in. A wind shift, sudden and strong, caused the boom to swing across the deck in an accidental jibe. The boom caught Batten and knocked him overboard. All three men were now in the water. The boat, with no one at the helm, just kept drifting. Once you're in the water and your boat is moving away, your chances drop fast. None of them were strong swimmers. The seas were choppy enough to make staying afloat difficult. The yacht would have been out of reach within minutes. The coroner effectively ruled out foul play. This was a cascade of bad luck, poor timing, and the ocean doing what the ocean does. Not everyone bought the coroner's explanation. The families spent tens of thousands of dollars hiring planes and boats to keep searching long after the official effort ended, convinced there had to be another answer. The fenders became a focal point for speculation. They were deployed along the hull when the boat was found, which some family members saw as evidence another vessel had come along. Maritime experts will tell you that fenders typically mean docking or meeting another boat, which opened the door to darker possibilities: pirates, drug smugglers, something more sinister than an accident. But the police found no evidence of anyone else being aboard, and more to the point, the video footage from that morning showed the fenders were already out when they left the marina. Plenty of small boats, just leave them deployed, nothing unusual about it. Other ideas surfaced over time. Maybe they grounded on a reef and all got off to push free, only to watch the boat catch wind and sail away without them. Freak weather events, rogue waves, environmental anomalies. The kind of explanations people reach for when the simple answer feels insufficient. But the conditions that day weren't catastrophic. The waves were a little rough, but nothing that would sweep three men off a deck all at once unless something specific went wrong. The most likely explanation remains the one the coroner proposed: a fishing lure, a rescue attempt, a shifting wind, and three men in the water with no way back aboard. The haunting part is how routine everything seemed right up until the moment it turned catastrophic. A simple task, a split-second decision, and suddenly three men were gone. Their bodies were never recovered. The families never got closure, and that's why the Kaz still haunts us. What's your take? Does the coroner's scenario make sense to you? Or do you lean toward one of the other theories? And maybe the bigger question, Why do modern ghost ships still unsettle us when we can track nearly everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. October 1955. 25 people abandon their ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They climb into life rafts and disappear forever, and the ship keeps floating for 5 more weeks. Here's the problem: that ship was virtually unsinkable, and the people who left it knew that. This is the story of the Joyita and how making the right decision can still end in tragedy. Welcome to Shipwreck History. This is part 3 of our ghost ship series. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and help support our channel. By 1955, the Joyita had lived several lives. Built in 1931, she started as a luxury yacht, served as a Navy patrol boat during World War II, and eventually landed with Captain Thomas "Dusty" Miller, a British sailor running trading and fishing charters in Samoa. At some point, she'd been refitted for hauling fish, with thick cork lining added to insulate refrigerated holds. That modification, meant to keep cargo cold, had an unintended side effect. It made the Joyita virtually unsinkable. Between the cork and her wooden construction, she'd stay afloat no matter how much water came aboard. At the time, Miller was struggling. Failed fishing trips had left him in debt, but he'd finally secured something that could turn things around: a government contract for regular runs to islands north of Samoa. Steady work, regular income, the kind of contract that could clear his debts if he could just make it work. On October 3, 1955, at 5 in the morning, the Joyita departed Apia Harbor in Samoa, bound for a group of islands about 300 nautical miles away. In good conditions, it's about 48 hours of sailing. The cargo was routine: medical supplies, food, timber, and empty oil drums. 25 people were aboard, including a government official, a doctor, and 2 children. But they were leaving with a problem. The day before departure, the port engine's clutch had failed. Miller made the call to go anyway, running on just the starboard engine. It would slow them down, but the voyage was short enough that it seemed manageable. At 6:45 that evening, they made a routine radio check-in from George Point. Everything was fine. Then, silence. By October 6, the Joyita was overdue for arrival. No distress signal had been received, no communication at all. The Royal New Zealand Air Force launched a massive search operation, covering 100,000 square miles of open ocean. They found nothing. For 5 weeks, search planes crisscrossed the Pacific. The Joyita had simply vanished with all 25 people aboard. Then on November 10th, a captain of a merchant ship spotted something unusual near the Fiji Islands. A vessel, severely listing, port rail underwater, covered in barnacles, drifting more than 600 miles off course. They approached cautiously and boarded. The ship was partially flooded but still afloat, exactly as her design intended. In the engine room, they discovered a corroded pipe that had been leaking, flooding the bilges and lower deck. The starboard engine was covered with mattresses. Someone had tried to make some kind of makeshift repair. The port engine was still disassembled from the original clutch problem. The flying bridge was destroyed. The canvas canopy was torn away. Windows were smashed. It looked like the ship had taken a beating from something. The radio was tuned to 2182, the international distress frequency, but when they examined it, they found the wiring was faulty. The aerial was severed, and that radio could only transmit about 2 miles, instead of the 100+ it should have managed. All the lifeboats and rafts were gone. The doctor's bag sat on deck with blood-stained bandages inside, showing someone had been injured. The clocks had stopped at 10:25 p.m. Every light switch in the ship was in the on position. Whatever happened, it happened at night. Captain Miller's logbook, sextant, and chronometer were missing, taken in the rush to abandon ship. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the cabin, cups still sitting where they'd been set down, as if the crew had simply stepped away for a moment. Evidence suggested the crew had been trying to survive aboard after losing power, improvising solutions in a desperate attempt to keep going. Think about that scene for a moment. An empty vessel, lights still on, radio tuned to the distress frequency, drifting hundreds of miles off course, no one aboard. And the question that haunted investigators: why would anyone abandon a ship designed to stay afloat? In February 1956, a formal investigation was convened. For 5 days, they heard testimony from more than 50 witnesses. Experts examined every piece of evidence from the Joyita. The focus kept coming back to the same question: why abandon ship? The investigation commissioner's assessment was blunt. The Joyita was designed to stay afloat even when flooded. The final ruling offered no answer, unable to determine the fate of those aboard based on available evidence. The Joyita was towed to Fiji for detailed examination. Once righted, the heavy barnacle growth on her port side confirmed what investigators suspected. She'd been listing at this angle for weeks. The fuel remaining in her tanks told another story. She'd traveled roughly 243 miles before her systems failed, meaning she was abandoned only about 50 miles short of her destination. Harbor masters who examined her were baffled that anyone would leave a vessel in this condition, especially one designed to be virtually unsinkable. But when all the pieces of this mystery are laid out, a picture starts to form. Not a complete one, but enough to see the shape of what likely happened. The corroded pipe in the engine room had probably been leaking for some time before anyone noticed. Ships often take on water slowly at first. By the time someone discovered the flooding, it had become serious, and it was discovered around 10:25 at night, in darkness with the ship already listing badly. The leak likely started sometime after 9 p.m. on their second night at sea, with 9 hours of darkness still ahead. As water flooded in, the single working engine would have struggled to maintain steering. The ship started tilting sideways against the waves, taking on that severe list. Something that might have been manageable in daylight became a nightmare scenario in pitch darkness. With water rising, the ship tilting dangerously, and no way to know how bad things really were. Every minute would have felt like the ship was about to go under. Someone went to send a distress signal by tuning the radio to the emergency frequency. The equipment appeared to work. Lights came on, dials responded. They believed they transmitted an SOS. They had no way of knowing a broken cable connected to the antenna meant their call for help traveled maybe 2 miles before dying in the static. They thought help was coming. The evidence suggests they'd hit something earlier: the destroyed flying bridge, the torn canopy. These point to a collision with debris or a submerged object that started the flooding. Someone had been injured badly enough to need medical attention, leaving those blood-stained bandages behind. Miller faced an impossible decision with incomplete information. His ship was taking on water. His navigation equipment was compromised, and as far as he knew, rescue was on the way. The Joyita was only about 50 miles from her destination, but it might as well have been 500. Miller gave the order, everyone into the life rafts. It was the logical, reasonable decision. The decision that seemed like the only option at the time. It was also the decision that killed them, because the ship they abandoned kept floating for 5 more weeks, and the help they were waiting for never received their call. Once those life rafts separated in the darkness and strong Pacific currents, the chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. The search area became impossibly large, even with provisions for several days. 25 people scattered across the open ocean and small rafts faced overwhelming odds. The search for survivors turned up nothing. No bodies were ever recovered. No life rafts were ever found. Ocean currents in that region could have carried them in any direction. Some have speculated they may have reached a remote island and died there. Their remains never discovered. As of today, all 25 people are officially listed as missing. The investigation considered everything from piracy to Cold War conspiracies. But none of it fit the evidence. The simplest explanation, the one that fits what was found, is also the cruelest. A series of reasonable decisions led to catastrophe. The Joyita represents one of those rare maritime tragedies, where the ship survived and the people didn't. She was engineered specifically to stay afloat no matter what, and she did exactly what she was built to do. But naval architecture can't account for human psychology under pressure. The line between survival and disappearance came down to minutes and assumptions. Sometimes the safest place is the one that looks the most dangerous, and sometimes doing everything that seems right leads to the worst possible outcome. The Pacific Ocean kept its secret. 25 people vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty ship that refused to sink. In a quiet corner of the Pacific, Entire warships sit exactly where they went down. Holes upright. Aircraft still in hangars. This lagoon once anchored a major naval base, busy with repairs, supply runs, and daily routines. Then a single operation changed everything, and those routines stopped without warning. Today, the ships rest in clear, relatively shallow water, sealed off from time. Divers describe a strange calm, like stepping into a moment that history paused and never restarted. This is the story of the ghost fleet of Chuuk Lagoon. Welcome to Shipwreck History. This is the final video in our ghost ship series. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and help support our channel. And don't forget to check out our other videos in the series. In early 1944, Chuuk Lagoon was Japan's most fortified naval base in the Pacific. The lagoon sits in Micronesia, roughly 2,000 miles southeast of Tokyo, where a barrier reef creates a natural harbor, vast enough to anchor an entire fleet. The Japanese Imperial Navy had transformed this location into their headquarters in the Pacific, building the most fortified naval base outside Japan itself. By February 1944, the lagoon had become critical to sustaining Japan's war across the Pacific. Warships, cargo vessels, oil tankers, and submarines crowded the anchorage. Every day brought new arrivals carrying supplies bound for Japanese forces on other islands. Protected by distance and heavy defenses, the base had operated for 2 years without serious challenge. It seemed untouchable. The scale of operations was staggering. At any given time, dozens of ships moved through the area. Aircraft lined the runways of 5 separate airfields built across the islands. Repair facilities operated around the clock, servicing damaged vessels and aircraft returning from combat. Supply depots held months' worth of ammunition, fuel, and provisions. The lagoon was more than just a parking spot for warships. It was a self-contained logistics hub that kept Japan's entire Pacific operation running. If they lost Chuuk, the supply chain would collapse. American codebreakers knew better. Intelligence reports revealed exactly what sat in that lagoon: a massive concentration of ships and supplies that had become impossible to ignore. The timing made Chuuk an obvious target. American forces were pushing through the Marshall Islands, and this base represented the last major obstacle to controlling the Central Pacific. Neutralized Chuuk, and Japan's ability to reinforce or resupply the island would collapse. The Japanese had sensed the danger and moved their largest warships to safer waters, but the merchant fleet stayed behind, along with hundreds of aircraft and enough supplies to sustain operations for months. February 17, 1944, dawn breaks over Chuuk Lagoon. The fleet rests at anchor, most crews still asleep. Then the sky fills with aircraft. Carriers Enterprise, Intrepid, Essex, and Yorktown had positioned themselves in darkness and launched their strikes before sunrise. Over 500 aircraft descended on the base in coordinated waves: fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes hitting targets across the lagoon simultaneously. The Japanese had almost no warning. Ships scrambled to raise anchor and man their guns as anti-aircraft fire erupted across the water, but the attack was already overwhelming. Many vessels never even got their engines started. The destruction followed a pattern. American dive bombers targeted the larger merchant vessels first, the ones carrying the most valuable cargo. Torpedo planes went after tankers and warships, aiming below the waterline where damage would be catastrophic. Fighters attacked anything that moved: aircraft on runways, personnel on decks, and gun crews firing from shore. The Japanese fought back where they could, but their aircraft were caught on the ground or trapped in the holds of cargo ships. By midday on the 17th, the outcome was already clear. Cargo ships carrying fighter aircraft burned where they sat. Oil tankers erupted into flames that spread across the water's surface. When ammunition ships exploded, the blast shook the entire lagoon. The attack didn't stop. It continued through the 17th and into the 18th, when American forces launched the first carrier-based night strike in naval history. For 2 straight days, aircraft returned in waves, systematically destroying everything they could find. American losses were relatively light: 25 aircraft and their crews, nothing compared to what was happening below. When the smoke cleared, more than 40 ships lay at the bottom of the lagoon. Another 275 aircraft were destroyed, some scattered across the seabed, others still trapped in the holds of sunken cargo vessels. The human cost cut deeper than the material losses. Approximately 4,500 Japanese servicemen died in those 2 days. The lagoon that had been Japan's fortress had become a tomb. The Japanese abandoned the base immediately. No salvage operation followed, no attempt to rebuild. The ships had gone down in water too deep for Japan's divers to reach, and in 48 hours, one of their most critical bases had been eliminated. The consequences spread across the Pacific. Japanese forces on outlying islands had depended on Chuuk for supplies and reinforcement. Now they were cut off. Equipment piled up in Japanese ports, with nowhere to send it. The American island hopping campaign, which had taken months of careful planning for each objective, suddenly accelerated. What had seemed like an impenetrable fortress had become a graveyard in just days. Japan would never come back from it. For decades, the wreck sat untouched. Coral began growing across steel hulls. Schools of fish moved into spaces where men had worked, and over time, the ocean slowly transformed the battlefield into something else. In 1969, Jacques Cousteau and his team arrived to explore what had been left behind. His documentary, Lagoon of Lost Ships, revealed something remarkable. The ships hadn't just sunk, they'd been preserved. Vessels sat upright on the bottom with cargo still secured in their holds. Artifacts remained scattered exactly where they'd fallen. The film showed engine rooms, mess halls, and bridges that looked untouched by time, as if the crews had simply stepped away and never returned. The footage brought global attention to what had become known as the Ghost Fleet of Chuuk Lagoon. Two of the most famous wrecks in the Ghost Fleet are the Fujikawa Maru and the San Francisco Maru. The Fujikawa Maru sits upright at 120 feet, one of dozens of armed cargo ships that had kept Japan's war effort supplied across the Pacific. Divers exploring her holds discovered Zero fighter aircraft still inside. Artillery shells and depth charges remain stacked where they were loaded. Aircraft parts still fill the cargo spaces. The bridge stands intact, and its telegraph is frozen mid-signal, while coral grows through the windows. This single ship captures what Japan was shipping to the war, and what they lost as a result of the attack. The San Francisco Maru sits deeper, and divers call her the $1 million wreck for good reason. She'd survived the first day anchored near one of the islands, but aircraft found her on February 18th. Her cargo holds contain a complete military arsenal, tanks with intact treads, trucks positioned as if waiting to roll off the deck, mines and torpedoes still secured in their racks. A bulldozer remains chained down, ready for construction work at some island airfield it never reached. Human remains found aboard were treated with proper respect, because this vessel didn't just carry cargo. It held an entire operation that got packed into steel and sent to the bottom before it could be used. The human presence lingers throughout the fleet. Sake bottles are scattered in crew quarters. Shoes look like someone just stepped out of them. Gas masks look neatly placed down where they were last left. Personal belongings lay where they landed in those final moments. The preservation is almost unsettling in its completeness. In the Fujikawa Maru's engine room, tools hang on their racks as if the engineers just stepped out. Gauges and dials remain readable through layers of coral. The galley still has cooking equipment in place. Deeper in the San Francisco Maru, divers find medical supplies and communications equipment still in their original locations. These wrecks are different from other dive sites, not just for what went down with them, but for how little it has changed. The ships look ready to sail, frozen mid-operation, surrounded by 80 years of salt water and silence. These aren't just historical sites, they're graves for the thousands who never left. The individual wrecks tell their own stories, but together they reveal something bigger. By late 1944, the volume of material moving through Chuuk Lagoon reveals just how desperate Japan's situation had become. Some cargo remains unidentified, classified equipment, and unknown weapon systems, materials that archaeologists still work to understand decades later. Marine archaeologists have mapped and documented these sites systematically, drawing insights about Japanese logistics, manufacturing, and strategic priorities during the war's final years. Some areas stay restricted because ammunition and explosives still sit in corroded casings that might be dangerous. Other sections remain closed out of respect for the human remains that couldn't be recovered. The lagoon functions as both an archaeological site and cemetery, protected under international law as a war grave where salvage is prohibited. That protection matters for another reason: environmental concerns. The ships recoil slowly, but continuously. And the ecosystem that grew around these wrecks now faces contamination from the vessels that created it. Yet despite the risks, the battlefield has become a sanctuary. The wrecks function as artificial reefs, supporting marine life across the lagoon. Coral blankets every surface, while fish occupy spaces that once held ammunition. What was built to destroy now sustains life. Thousands of divers visit annually, exploring these sites while remembering what happened here. The ghost fleet of Chuuk Lagoon remains frozen at the moment everything ended. More than 40 ships, 275 aircraft, and 4,500 lives, all claimed by the lagoon. It remains history's largest ghost fleet, and perhaps the most accessible window into a moment when the balance of the Pacific War shifted irrevocably. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share, and let us know in the comments what shipwrecks you want us to cover next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And until next time, keep exploring.